As we learnt last week, during the 16th century, China briefly overtook India as the richest region on earth, when the Chinese Ming dynasty were at their zenith. I now want to look at the 17th century, as this was the last time that India had the world's largest economy, more than 25% of world GDP at the time. This was the period when the Spanish began to pour gold and silver from the Americas into the European economy, where it circulated and gave the Portuguese, the Dutch, and then the British, the gold and silver bullion that Europeans needed to sustain their appetite for trade with India. Over 3 centuries, trading settlements were established by Europeans extending right along India's shores, many of these involving arrangements with local rulers, and some requiring the firmans or the decrees from the Mughal court itself. On this map, you'll see the growth of the Mughal Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries, reaching its greatest extent at the death of Aurangzeb in 1707. Only the southernmost tip of India, including Tiruvananthapuram and the temple town of Madurai, for example, remained independent of the Mughal influence. The European settlements up and down India's coasts waxed and waned in importance over the centuries. But let's look at just how much activity there was along India's coasts by Europeans, especially during this period 1500 to 1800, and in particular the 17th century. Some of the more significant of the European settlements up India's west coast include Kollam near Tiruvananthapuram and the Padmanabhaswamy temple, the entrance to the backwaters of Kerala where so many spices could be grown, Cochin, famed to this day for its port and iconic Chinese fishing nets, Calicut, where Vasco da Gama had first landed in 1498 for the Portuguese, the French settlement of Mahe, Kannur, Mangalore, and the Portuguese stronghold of Goa. Then there are the 7 islands that the Greeks called 2,000 years earlier Heptanicia. The Portuguese called them Bombeia because of the good bay that could provide a place for their boats and ships to dock. This area was eventually given to King Charles II of England as dowry when he married the Portuguese Princess Catherine de Braganza in 1662. The British renamed it Bombay, and it rapidly became the British centre of power on the western coast. And today is India's commercial capital, renamed as Mumbai in 1995, and home of the Hindi cinema industry, Bollywood. The British presence actually began, and was initially strongest in the early 17th century, in Surat, in Gujarat, where to this day 90% of all the diamonds in the world are said to be cut and polished. So if you're lucky enough to have some yourself, perhaps some earrings or an engagement or wedding ring, then the chances are that that stone, that diamond, passed through Indian hands in this town. As it happens, until diamonds were discovered in Brazil in the 18th century by the Portuguese and southern Africa in the 19th century, all the diamonds in the world up until that point had come from India. And finally, on either side of the Bay of Cambay, once a key water gateway to the Indus Valley civilization, we have the Portuguese settlements of Daman and Diu. Of course, south of India lies Sri Lanka, also an active centre of trade. First with the Portuguese in Colombo, Gaul and Mathura, then Trincomalee, before the Dutch gained control in the middle of the 17th century, a time when the Portuguese, partly distracted by the growing value of Brazil to them, began to lose their grip on India. Although amazingly, Goa, Daman and Diu remained under Portuguese control until 1961, making the Portuguese not just the first Europeans to establish permanent settlements in India, but also the last to leave. Up India's eastern coast, there were the Dutch in Nagapatnam, Pulicat, Masalipatnam or Machilipatnam, and Chinsur. Even the Danish had trading posts in Tranquebar in the southeast and Serampore in Bengal. In addition to the French settlement of Mahe on the west coast, the French were also present in Karikal, Yanam and Chandanagar. The centre of French power in India was in the south, in Pondicherry, which still has French street names to this day and a fusion cuisine to go with it. To the north of Pondicherry, the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and most importantly the British, settled in the area north and south of what is now called Chennai, known as Madras for more than 3 centuries. Further north on the western coast were the Dutch in Machilipatnam, the French in Yanam, and the British in Visakhapatnam. On the Hooghly River, one of the main distributaries of the mighty Ganges and Brahmaputra into the Bay of Bengal, the heart of India's fertile and wealthy Bengal. All the European powers at some point had trading settlements. Most importantly, the British, whose Fort William would become Calcutta and their capital in India until they moved it to Delhi in 1911. Being on the Bay of Bengal, the Hooghly River, and therefore the Ganges, meant that you could send boats all the way up the Ganges and the Yamuna to the centre of India through Uttar Pradesh, what is now Uttar Pradesh, and into the northwest. Now, because the Europeans had little to offer in terms of their own manufactured products, they were mostly shipping silver and gold in order to pay for Indian goods. The European powers began to start controlling this trade between India and her neighbours, the East African coast, Arabia, and most importantly, Southeast Asia and those famous spice islands. The Dutch, for example, would come to India, buy enormous quantities of fantastic Indian textiles, and then ship them over to the Spice Islands where they would exchange them for the spices that they so desired. At this time, therefore, wealth was pouring into India, and the Indians had sophisticated banking and merchant networks stretching right across the country to circulate that wealth, enable internal domestic trade to flourish, as well as the international trade with the Europeans. The Europeans were probably a tiny fraction of the actual trade that was going on in India and between India and her neighbours. The most powerful ruler of India during the first half of the 17th century was the Mughal emperor Shah Jahan. The wealth that consolidated during his reign with him can easily be appreciated when you see the incredible constructions of his time as emperor. The entire city of Shah Jahanabad, now often known as Old Delhi, or named after its main street, Chandni Chowk, which translates as Moonlight Square. Today, this is still a bustling market, one of the largest wholesale markets in Asia, and certainly the largest in North India. Chandni Chowk stretches through the city from Shah Jahan's Red Fort on the banks of the Yamuna River to the Fatehpuri Masjid. The street is now home to Jain temples, Digamba and Shwetamba, Hindu temples, a Sikh Gurdwara, and a church, as well as the mosque. In addition to the master plan itself, there is the glorious architecture of the Red Fort, including its famous walls. And most impressive of all is the Jama Masjid, so vast that its courtyard can hold more than 25,000 people praying at one time, as they regularly do to this day, especially for major festivals like Eid and the Friday prayers. However, Shah Jahan is best known for what he created 100 miles further south. Downstream of Delhi, along the banks of the Yamuna, is the city of Agra. For it is here that he built for his beloved wife Taj Mahal, mother of 13 of his children, the extraordinary mausoleum we now know as the Taj Mahal. What do South Africa, Peru, Belgium, Persia, Afghanistan, Arabia, Tibet, China all have in common? Well, they all provided some of the materials used to build the Taj Mahal. So if we think of globalization as a new phenomenon, then how about that for a global supply chain? Demonstrating the global trade networks of the day, the Taj includes so many precious stones. There's the blue lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, green malachite from southern Africa, black onyx all the way from Belgium, turquoise from Tibet, green jade from China, and the remarkable orange-red carnelian from Arabia, which glows when light is shone on it. And where did the money come to pay for this? And perhaps the gold that made up the mighty finial that stood on top of the dome before the British removed it and replaced it with a bronze one in the early 19th century? Well, that almost certainly came from the silver and from the gold that the Spanish took out of the Americas and brought into the European economy from where it found its way through trade to India. Parts of the building are obviously made of local materials. There's jasper from Punjab, red coral from southern India, red sandstone, and that famous translucent white Makrana marble from Rajasthan. The chief architect himself was said to be the Persian Ustad Ahmed Lahori. I want to now just put in a few words about the Mughals. They were Muslims from Central Asia and came from fierce stock. Their founder Babur, who seized control of northern India in 1526, claimed to be descended from the legendary 14th century Timur, also known as Tamerlane, on his father's side, and the 13th century great Mughal himself, Genghis Khan, on his mother's side. The Mughals didn't practice primogeniture, where the eldest son would inherit. Instead, intense fighting would ensue, often involving lots of treachery, in the battle for succession to the throne. The most notorious empire of them all, Aurangzeb, in his quest for the throne, had his elder brother Darushika paraded naked on the back of an elephant through the streets of Delhi before he was then killed by his guards. Darushika was an amazing man. He translated Hindu Upanishad poetry into Persian and was a keen scholar of the Hindu philosophies as much as he was of his beloved Quran. Aurangzeb even imprisoned his father, who had favoured Darushika to succeed him. Aurangzeb therefore became ruler of the richest empire in the world. China at this time was in huge turmoil with the Qing challenge to the Ming dynasty, resulting in 25 million deaths and destroying the Chinese economy. Aurangzeb was even referred to as Alamgir, the conqueror of the universe. So in order for the Europeans to trade with India, they either had to gain permissions from local rulers, for example those of southern India, or Firman's decrees from the Mughal court itself in Agra or Delhi. There are some parallels between this and the situation today, with the central government and state governments both involved in different respects with foreign investment decisions, whether it is allowed, how, where the companies should be able to set up factories or set up software development centres, and we'll return to this theme later on. But let us finish this unit by demonstrating the wonder Europe had for 17th century India. Augustus the Strong of Saxony, in modern-day Germany, commissioned his favourite goldsmith, Dinglinger, to create a work that could capture the fabled wealth of the court of the great Mughal. Whereas this opulence actually existed for real in India, at this time, all that one of Europe's most wealthiest rulers could hope for was a tiny scale model. That was all to change over the next 2 centuries. From the mid-18th century to 1947, India would fall under British rule, and India's share of the world economy would collapse from 25% to less than 4%.